All right, hello everyone. Welcome to week 4. This week we will start discussing different types of terrorism. We're going to start with state terrorism. This video is going to be a little bit longer than some of the other ones, so please bear with me. All right, so state terrorism is terrorism that's committed by governments and quasi-governmental agencies and personnel against perceived enemies of the state. It can be directed either externally against international enemies or domestically, within the boundaries of that particular country. State-level political violence is the best organized and is the most far-reaching application of terrorist violence. These can be extensive campaigns because the state or government obviously has large amounts of resources that dissident terrorism or dissident terrorists would not have. So the question you would be asking, is why would states use terrorism internationally, as like a form of foreign policy? Why would they do this domestically? So internationally, the state defines its interests, in a number of ways. They have political interests, they have economic interests, and they have ideological interests. So in order to defend those interests, governments have a variety of ways that they can do that. But terrorism could be one of these, many different ways that they can, defend interests. Domestically, they use that, as like the states need to maintain their internal security, to maintain order, among their people. So state terrorism is official government support for policies of violence, repression, intimidation, directed at real enemies or also perceived enemies. Those that commit state terrorism are often oftentimes are government personnel, right? Because they're acting as part of the government or on directive from the government, but can also be used or committed by unofficial agents, people that don't exactly work for the government, kind of like a mercenary almost. All right, so let's get into this a little bit more. There's several different models that have been designed to describe state terrorism. There are sponsors, enablers, and cooperators. Sponsors of terrorism are those that actively promote terrorism and have been formally designed or designated as rogue states or state sponsors of terror under U.S. law. Enablers are states that operate in an environment where they may not be completely cooperating in the facilitation of terrorism, but also are doing things that help it to occur. Okay, enablers, so they may not be the ones that are actually doing it, but they're kind of helping it along. Cooperators are kind of these kind of unique security environments where states cooperate with each other, on this particular thing, even though they may disagree on a variety of other topics. So when they choose to use state terrorism, they can use different forms of violence, right? There's all kinds of different kinds of violence. It could be straight out warfare, it could be genocide, it could be assassinations, it could be torture, right? There's all kinds of different types of violence that can be used when you're talking about terrorism, especially from the state. So just based on that, it may sound like these linkages between, states and their use of terror is pretty straightforward. And it might be, right? It may be very clear. But like a lot of other things with terrorism, a lot of times it's much more murkier, much more harder to define. It's rarely just real, straight, easily identifiable. Okay, so governments, have different ways that they develop when they're sponsoring terrorism or using terrorism, but oftentimes it's ways that cannot come back to them. Okay, and that's generally how it works, right? Because you don't want to be the country that's sponsoring terrorism. Now, obviously, there's countries that don't care, but most countries don't want it to actually come back on them. So it's usually covert, it's secret, so that way governments can deny that they're involved in it. So when a state is overtly involved in terrorist behavior, that's known as state patronage. Okay, and this is active participation in and encouragement of terrorist behavior. So as foreign policy, this occurs when government takes the side of a politically violent movement or some group that is operating outside of its borders. Okay, so the state then directly assists the group in their cause, and oftentimes will continue to do so even after some terrorism has been committed. So when governments are doing this, they'll often justify participation, in several different ways. They may accept that terrorism is a necessary tactic. They can deny that what occurred is actually terrorism, which is where we get back to our definitions. Deny that the incident occurred at all, or issue one of these kind of milquetoast blanket condemnations of all kinds of violence. So in domestic policy, it occurs, when a regime engages in direct violent repression against the domestic enemy through the use of state security personnel. In these cases, they'll say it's necessary to suppress this clear and present threat to national security, to maintain law and order during a time of crisis, protect fundamental cultural values that are threatened by subversives, or to restore stability to institutions that have been damaged by a domestic enemy. Okay, so that's state patronage. The other type of state sponsorship is state assistance. Okay, this is a state's tacit participation in encouragement of terrorist behavior. Okay, they don't usually directly engage, when you're talking about assistance, but they'll also use proxies or agents and implicitly take part in the behavior. Okay, this is a much more indirect method than state patronage. So state assistance is foreign policies when the state indirectly supports a violent group operating beyond its borders. Okay, so unlike when it directly sponsors or patronizes, if it's only assisting the group, the government may or may not continue after that group commits terrorism. Okay, there may be a terrorist event, and then they're like, "Oh, well, we're out." So they may deny, that the link exists between them. They may admit that there was some support, but we didn't support this because the group went rogue. They may admit or deny the link, but they also may label the people as freedom fighters, assert that they have a just cause. The incident was unfortunate, or blame the adversaries for creating the environment where it could occur. Okay, so then domestically, state assistance is essentially using the state using sympathetic groups. Okay, but this also can occur at the same time as state patronage. So sometimes, sympathetic groups will be side by side with the state security personnel. Okay, they may blame their adversary for the breakdown of order and call on the people to help restore order. Argue the proxy violence is patriotic sentiment used to suppress threat to national security. They may call on the parties to cease hostilities, but blame the adversary for what's going on. Assure everyone that the government is doing everything in its power to restore law and order. Okay, so there's a variety of ways where they can justify, what they're doing. So at this point in the book, there's a bunch of examples of different places where this stuff has been occurring. So it really kind of helps explain these two different concepts a little bit better if you can put an actual example to it. So be sure you check those out, and think about patronage versus assistance. All right, so now we've kind of defined, what it is. So why would they do it? Okay, so if you're a government or a country, you can't always just send conventional armed forces somewhere to achieve some strategic objective. Okay, they also may not be able to, aside from just the PR aspects of just you can't just send troops places, right? They also may not be able to logistically, politically, or militarily be able to confront the adversary. So at that point, terrorism becomes a viable option. And even though they're trying to conceal participation, there is some advantages to states using terror. Okay, one is it's pretty inexpensive. aside from like a full-scale war, right? That's expensive. Terrorism is pretty inexpensive. Okay, they often have limited consequences, especially if they're good at concealing, right? If they're able to conceal their involvement, um, there's really little to be lost and lots to gain, right? Um, if you're a weaker state or weaker government, you can raise the stakes, and you can keep raising the stakes and make them higher and higher and higher, to maybe you get to a point where your stronger adversary doesn't want to anymore, right? They're not willing to bear, the stakes that are happening to them. Okay. So that once they decide to actually support a terrorist group or a group that may commit terror, they have several options at that point. They can provide ideological support, where they indoctrinate the group or members into the ideology, by agents of the state. They can give financial support. Okay, terrorist organizations require quite a bit of money, so financial support is helpful. It's really hard for them to fundraise, right, and acquire needed resources. Some of these groups are a little bit better at fundraising, and the internet has made this easier. Um, but it's still not real easy to acquire, the stuff that they need. They can send military support, weapons, training, logistics, that sort of thing. They can provide operational support, things like safe havens, false documents. If they need some kind of specialized weaponry, kind of whatever the group needs to do what they need to do. Okay, the state can also give specific instructions, to where they initiate the terrorist attacks. Um, and then they can either be directly involved in those attacks, or they can get others to do it for them. So all those kinds of ways are all ways that states, they can participate in terrorism. So it's kind of a lot to kind of think about. So uh, if we kind of frame these into like a policy framework, there's four main, policy frameworks for state-sponsored terrorism: moral support, technical support, selective participation, and active participation. All right, so moral support is politically sympathetic sponsorship, okay, where the state embraces the main beliefs and principles of a cause. Okay, hey, we understand, we're with you, we feel you, we support, what you guys believe in. Technical support is providing logistical support for the group, form of training, arms, safe houses, sanctuary, right? And those things can be either direct or indirect. Uh, Selective support uh, means that you sometimes support them, so it may be like episode specific, okay, where uh, a group is going to do a specific thing and the government supports them doing that particular thing, or maybe a group of things, right? But after that, hey, we're not going to support you anymore. They didn't support them before that, but we're going to support you for this one particular thing that you're doing. And then active participation is mostly like joint operations. Okay, it's the government personnel carrying out campaigns and incidents with the other group. Okay, and this is the active participation is usually more of a large scale, kind of ongoing kind of conflict thing. All right, so that's kind of a quick hitter on terrorism as foreign policy. All right, so now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about terrorism as domestic policy. Okay, so state terrorism as domestic policy is when the state uses politically motivated violence against groups within their own borders. Okay, you can use regular state security forces, or they may use like paramilitary groups or even death squads in some situations. Okay, one reason they do this is to try to legitimize their state authority. Okay, and there's a lot of ways that they can do that. Okay, some resort to violence to like intimidate dissenters. They try to quell political speech and political opponents. They might create a scapegoat. This other group, they make them they're responsible for all these problems. Um, so they scapegoat them, and then they restore order. Um, so how the state goes about it oftentimes depends on what type of government is actually in place at the state. So there's four general types of governments, and the level and types of violence that are used varies by the type of government. Okay, so we're going to talk about these from the least to the most as far as uh, use of violence. All right, so the first one is a democracy. Okay, so in a democracy, your government's elected, and the power of the state is clearly limited by a constitution. All right, so in this um, type of government, they're the least likely to use violence against people within their borders. Least likely to use violence as a form of terrorism. Okay. The second type is authoritarianism, and this is where the power and authority rests with the government, and the people have little power. Okay. Authoritarian leaders, they may be elected, but they often serve unlimited periods of time, and they really don't have a system to check the authoritarian leader's power. Okay, so the chance of abuse is much higher, but you don't have the checks and balances like what you have in a democracy. All right, so after authoritarianism, you have totalitarianism, and this is total government regulation. Okay, all national authority originates in the government, and it can enforce its own version or vision of what an ordered society should look like. Okay, and these are more likely to use violence than authoritarian leaders. And finally, you have what they call crazy states. Essentially, these are failed states, that don't behave rationally. They don't behave like a regular country. There's often little to no central authority, or even, sometimes not even really like a recognizable government. Okay? But if they do, oftentimes are ruled by like violent warlords, and these places become havens for terrorist networks. Okay, so those are the most likely to have terrorism as domestic policy. So democracy the least, authoritarian, totalitarian, and then crazy states. All right, so Sederberg identified these three general broad categories of domestic state terrorism: unofficial repression, repressionist policy, and mass repression. All right, so unofficial repression is also known as vigilante state terrorism. This is where the government unofficially supports non-government groups and individuals. So essentially, the government's letting someone else do their dirty work. Um, Although sometimes there is some cooperation between state security agents and the vigilantes. Repressionist policy is when the government uses as policy a campaign of violence against groups within their borders to preserve the existing order. Okay, this is overt. The government clearly targets certain groups for violence. Nothing is really hidden, and this is one of the common ways in like a totalitarian regime. Okay, it could also be covert, and covert repression occurs through the use of like a secret police. Okay, so they have a security force that is covert and working, living among the people, and um, kind of like what the Nazis did back in the 40s. Okay, they had the secret police that would watch people and that sort of thing. Um, so official state terrorism is not always directed as what would be considered a subversive element, but it can be used to eliminate anyone who's considered undesirable. Okay, or also used as kind of an ethnic cleansing uh, type of policy. All right, so mass repression is also known as genocidal state domestic terrorism. Okay, this occurs when government mobilizes all its resources to eliminate a targeted group. Okay, it could be cultural minorities, it could be racial, it could be religious, it could be ethnic populations, or just a certain segment of society that believes differently. Okay, so while I know this probably sounds a lot like official government repression, um, but official government repression generally has some sort of limits. Okay, genocidal state repression does not. Okay, so it could also, it could result in the complete elimination of people, but it could also be used to eliminate a culture. Okay, through removing populations, prohibiting, certain religious, linguistic, or cultural identification. Okay, so official state repression, has limits to it. Like they're not just going out and killing everyone. Okay, genocidal state terrorism could very well be that. So why is all this allowed to continue? Right? How is it monitored? How you know? So there's both public and private organizations that monitor the use of violence by governments around the world. That is another time where the definition of terrorism becomes important. We're going to keep coming back to this over and over and over again. This definition of terrorism is really, really important when you start talking about these different types. Okay, so internationally, the U.S. State Department compiles a list of designated state sponsors of terrorism. These lists are fairly fluid, and countries are added and removed. And if you're talking about domestic terrorism, private agencies are more active in this domain. And a lot of times, instead of calling it terrorism, they refer to it as human rights abuses or human rights violations, possibly to avoid this problem of what's a terrorism. What's a terrorism? What is terrorism? Right? What is the definition of terrorism? Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, those are two of the more active kind of organizations doing this around the world. All right, so I'm going to stop here for this week. Be sure to complete your assignments. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.